What if I told you that vibe coding doesn't have to suck? There's actually a professional way of doing it. It's called specification-driven development. And GitHub has built an entire toolkit around it. It's called Spec Kit. I have been using it for 30 days in real projects, and by the end of this video, you will know what works, what doesn't work, and whether it's worth adopting. This is not a demo-based video. For that, follow the link in the top. As always, I like to start with one simple but powerful question. Why? Why do we need such a thing? For that, we need to go to the problem of vibe coding, the problems that we have when we just vibe code a solution, the problem with vibe coding as a whole. And the problem relies on one simple fact. We expect that prompting our code assistant with a simple prompt will output the perfect solution. But that would be just luck. It might work for something simple, something just for personal use, just a small script, just a tiny little thing. But what about those moments when that application starts growing and eventually is actually complex? When eventually there's actually a risk of doing something wrong? That's the problem. The problem of vibe coding is the fact that we have many different ways to achieve an end result. We know that this profession, this job of being a developer, being a builder, is all about trade-offs. But when we just prompt the system with just a tiny little bit of text and we expect something to get out perfect, where is the trade-off? Who took the decisions during the trade-offs? And that's the problem. Because being a developer or building something is all about those tiny little decisions. It's about taking decisions regarding approaches, frameworks, libraries, ways of doing it, requirements, non-functional requirements, expectations, edge cases. And we know that we need to discover all of that. Naturally, what would happen in your day-to-day as a developer without AI at all is that you will find many of those things during the process, during the cycle of the development. But now what we expect is that the LLM will find all of that for us. And that doesn't happen. That's the biggest problem. And that's the reason why nowadays we have something like the plan mode. Most code assistants already support something like the plan mode. If you don't use it already, just look around and see if your code assistant already supports it, because it's a game changer. But even plan mode is not enough for what we are looking for. Plan mode is great to have a better outcome from that prompt. However, it doesn't go through some important elements like thinking about what we are building, thinking about why we are building it, having decisions regarding trade-offs, splitting the work in different elements so once we start to implement it, we go one by one with a clear definition of what we are heading to. As a reaction to all of those problems, our industry came up with this idea of spec-driven development, also known as specification-driven development. Spec-driven development emerges as a new trend to deal with the problems of vibe coding. But we'll see in a moment that many of the ideas of spec-driven development have been in our industry for such a long time. In the past, we used to first start with a spec, then we would plan the work, then we would execute the work. So it's basically the same idea. But nowadays, in 2025, we are getting back to those principles just to deal with the problems of vibe coding. And what's the idea of this spec-driven development? So first is more than a tool. Okay, there's many tools to perform spec-driven development. And it starts with one simple activity. Once you need to build something new, what you do is to first specify it. You answer the question, why we are building this, what we are building, how will it be used? Once you start answering those questions, it will emerge things like functional requirements. Only then, once you have a clear vision of what you are building, you start thinking about how you are going to build it. So you go to the next stage, the plan stage. Once you are in the plan stage, those important decisions like how we are going to build this, which technology we are using to address a given technical requirement. All of those things are important in this moment. But first, you have the scope of that specification that you have built before. Once you have a clear plan on how you are going to implement this thing, this spec, now let's go to the next stage. Let's start thinking about which tasks do we need to implement in order to achieve that plan based on that specification. And you can extract that from the plan and from the spec. Only then we go to the implementation phase. We start going task by task and implementing it. The advantage of this cycle is that on each stage, each phase of this process, things that are not clear will emerge. Decisions can be taken. You can shape the form that things will emerge. But also, you start decomposing a big problem, discovering the different ways to do it, and taking those decisions before you finally say, let's do it. And this is what we are solving with spec-driven development, is all the things that we didn't have in the past with just vibe coding. And it's interesting because many different organizations came up with the conclusion that this would be great to deal with the problems of vibe coding, so they have been investing on tools, frameworks, libraries, whatever you want to call it, to do exactly this. The first one, it was AWS Kiro, I think, that is a product designed with that philosophy. Eventually, GitHub came up with this new thing, Spec Kit, that is the one that I'm talking about in this video, to do exactly the same. So two different tools, two different approaches to implement the same strategy to address the problems of vibe coding. And that led us to Spec Kit, a project built by GitHub, famous organization, open source, about that. And they have their own code assistants, GitHub Copilots. But the good news is that the philosophy behind this Spec Kit thing is that it is not locked to GitHub Copilot. You can use it with different agents, what is great. It was built in a way that you can apply it in different systems, with different agents. What means that if you have a big team working with different tools, you can still collaborate using this technology. Also, the way that it was built, it clearly builds on top of the concepts that have been in this code assistant ecosystem that is evolving extremely fast. And they are building this using the tools that we all have access to. It's not a special sauce of GitHub Copilot. It's something that can actually be reused. And Spec Kit became a success. Quickly, the number of stars, the number of votes that you can see on GitHub, the popularity grew extremely fast. And if you watch a quick intro to that product, you will see how amazing it is. It's actually stunning. It looks amazing. You want to use it. But also, there will be a question here, somewhere in the back of your brain, warning you about, does this work on my day-to-day job, on my real projects, or it can handle the complexity? Yeah, that's a fair question, and is exactly the one that I had when I first tried it. Because seeing it working on a greenfield project or seeing it working on a small blog is not the same as in a software that has a ton of features, that has years of history. So I proposed myself to do exactly that, to use this tool in an existing project for 30 days and see how it evolves and the challenges that I would face. During the process, I have learned a couple of things that I really like, and I want to talk about that, but also a couple of things that I'm not happy with it, and I want to share that. And by the end, I will share with you if I think it's worthy or not. One of my favorite things is the fact that it doesn't force you to use a given tool set. Actually, there's a ton of code assistants that you can use. You can use Copilot, obviously, but also you can use Cursor, you can use Cloud Code, you can use Gemini. There's many of them available. And the way that they have built it is quite smart. You just go through the process of the installation and we'll set up a couple of files inside of your repo. Also, you can create some links between the different configuration folders. So once someone in your team joins in and wants to use the same specs, it can take advantage of the same process. Okay, you don't need to maintain two different things because two different team elements use a different tool set. The other thing that I really like is the fact that all of that process of coming up with a spec with a plan, then we go and find the tasks and all of that, it leads to a ton of documentation that emerges naturally. Because during that process, there's many decisions being taken, there's many research documents being generated that we can take advantage of them, commit them as part of a pull request, and we have all of those decisions there. Okay, is a complete history of the reasoning that we have. While when compared with something like vibe coding, pure vibe coding, we don't have any of that. I would even argue that more often than not, we don't have even reasoning happening. We are just asking for something and expecting something back, but we don't have those trade-offs. But here, by using Spec Kit, we start seeing those documents emerging with those trade-offs in place, with the things that we clarified, with the functional requirements, with the plan, with the approaches, with all of that as part of our repo. And all of that with Markdown. That is the perfect language to build context with AI. The other thing that I like is the fact that while this works amazing when you are starting with a tiny little project, okay? It's the first day of that project, you start with that greenfield project, start building everything, and naturally it will work quite well. But also, you can go and start working on top of an existing project, a brownfield project. For that, you start by generating a constitution that is one of the key files built by Spec Kit. That is a quite smart idea. That is a definition of the rules and what is happening inside of that project. So then all the specs should respect the constitution. So you start with that, and then you can start building features using specs on top of the things that exist. So that's not a problem, okay? You can always pick it in the context of an existing project. We'll talk about in the problem section about what doesn't work that well in a brownfield project. But the good news is that at least you can start. The other thing that I really like that will naturally happen because of the process that is built inside of this spec-driven development process is the fact that we start asking the questions of why and what before the how. And we have a natural tendency to start with the how we are going to build something. Is this tech? Is that technology? I have seen this on a meetup, on a talk. I want to use it. So now we try to find a problem for a solution, right? So this will lead you to start by discussing with the agent about what we are building, why we are building it. So only then you go to the plan. And this simple two-step moment where the how comes after the other important questions is already extremely powerful. There's one more thing that I like. That is, once you start using it, you will realize that there's a ton of good practices that are baked into the process. You will see that the system naturally will try to follow an approach of test-driven development. You will see that the system will naturally try to find moments to use contract testing. You will see that many of the good ideas that the big organizations use are there. They are part of the process. Once you install Spec Kit and you start using that flow, once you get to the implementation, you are following a predefined approach that can work, that has been tested, that follows the best practices. So that's good news. So the feeling that I have after working with Spec Kit for 2 to 3 weeks is that Spec Kit will turn vibe coding into enterprise-grade vibe coding. Why do I say that? Because once you start seeing all of those processes, those steps, those elements of control that you have in place, those predefined ways of doing things with best practices and all of that, it actually feels like enterprise-grade software. But that doesn't mean that it works for everyone. There's a couple of problems. Actually, I did a walkthrough of Spec Kit with my class from my cohort where we build .NET applications that take advantage of AI to bring new features to the applications. And during that walkthrough, we have seen all of these benefits, but quite quickly we got to the problems, and they were quite evident. So if you want to join me on this cohort and learn how to bring AI into your .NET applications, just go to the link in the description. There's a new class starting soon. So going to the problems. If you use Spec Kit in the context of a a team that has been working together for a long time. There's ways of working, the typical techniques, the context of the project where you are working. You might feel that Spec Kit is too opinionated. You have your ways of doing things, and now the tool is trying to force you to work in a different way, to generate different artifacts, different types of tests, different approaches to write code. And while you can go in and adjust some files to update it, there's no predefined way, there's no recommendation on how to do it. And then it becomes maintenance. I would prefer a world where Spec Kit would have basically, during the wizard of configuration, a few decisions that you could take. For example, deciding, do you want to use TDD or not? Do you want to use contract testing or not? Kind of like picking the ways of working quite quickly. You can go with the recommended ones, okay, the default ones, or you can go into the personalization mode and take your decisions, but also extending the ones that exist. Do you have a given procedure that usually you follow? Just go ahead. Do you usually run something like mutation testing? Just have the markdown for that. And that currently is not well defined how to do it with Spec Kit, and it might create friction. After a while, there's one question that naturally emerges. Is this waterfall? Because it's actually what sometimes it will feel. I would say that the biggest difference is that in the past, waterfall used to be something that would take months, and it will go through different teams, from the architects to the developers to the QA team, and we'll go through this process, sending the artifacts to the other team and to the other team until something is pushed out of the door. This actually feels like waterfall at a low scale inside of my machine. It's me, it's the process, and it's my agents. It's a tiny little waterfall, I would say, but it feels like that. And one of the things that I don't like is the time that it takes to have a complete feedback cycle. To go from spec to see something, it takes a while. And during that time, I often feel unproductive because I write the specification and I will go and work on another stuff. And eventually I go back and I define the plan, and I might forget that that thing is running. I have that thing in the back of my mind, and I'm always concerned if it's the moment to go there and provide an input to move to the next stage. So from the moment where I start specifying and I play with it, it takes a while. But worse than that is that I might get to the point where I'm seeing the thing that I was building, and I came to the conclusion that something was not exactly defined in the way that I was looking for. Or now that I see this thing emerging into the reality, I don't like the experience. And going back and adjusting the specification is not that easy at the moment. Often, I came to the point where I simply roll back every single thing and start the process of specifying it once again with a refined input prompt in the first place, based on the things that I learned afterwards. And this is wasting time and wasting tokens, to be honest. Talking about context, this is the big problem, honestly. From my experience, once your project reaches a certain dimension, so after a few weeks working on that project, or once you go to a brownfield project that has years of history, what you will see is that the context window will quickly be full. And we know how important it is to manage the context window in the days of AI. For the first time, I've burned my Claude Max plan. I burned the tokens. And it was all because of Spec Kit, because with so many documents being generated, so many things being pulled into the context window, it consumes a ton of tokens. But worse than that is that if you push a ton of information into the context, after a while, compaction might run and you might lose some details, and eventually things are not as well defined or not as systematized as they used to be. I can tell you a story. I was working on one feature, defined the spec, went to the plan. I had several iterations through the plan, and eventually tasks, implementation. So it runs the implementation. And by the end of the implementation, it was strange that I had no new tests. But But usually it will go through the process of, for example, trying to perform test-driven development. So I tried to backtrack possible reasons for that. And I realized that there was a log on my Claude code saying, let's run the compaction. So my bet is that at a given point, the agent has to summarize things and lose some of those important instructions. So after a while, I might not be going through the same process over and over again. That is one of the biggest advantages of something like this, having a systematized way of building software. This is the big deal for me. And if with something like Claude Max, I reach the limits, what happens if you only have a small subscription, if you have just a small plan, if you are using something like a free tool? Can you even use this effectively for the long run? So after 30 days and going through all of those benefits, but also all of those problems, I came to the conclusion that this is not for every single type of project or every single type of developer. Honestly, I think that the sweet spot, it might be for that technical person that is not a developer or an hardcore developer, and he wants to quickly build something, for example, a prototype, and then, for example, deliver that prototype to the development team. Let's say that he's a product person, let's say. It's better to go through this process because the end result, it's much better than just vibe coding something. And at least you can find there in the repo all the decisions, all the contexts, all the important details. So once the developer picks that project and needs to understand why something was built in a given way, it can go back to the specs and to the plans and understand the context. So I can see a ton of value on this approach. So if we think about it, more than a tool, the approach, it's an approach that works pretty well for those that have been vibe coding stuff and they don't have the technical experience to take some important trade-offs, because the tool will guide you through a set of best practices, so the end result is much better. It's important to say that even being something so opinionated with so many systems and processes in place, this doesn't dismiss the fact that you need to know what you are building, that you need to understand the thing that you are building, that you need to understand how to design the solution. This is still an important job to perform. But the simple fact that you have those guidelines in place, those best practices, tends to deliver a better outcome. So after those 30 days, what will change for me? What am I keeping? What I'm just completely dismissing? So I will keep using Spec Kit, but just in a specific type of scenario. On a big project, something that I've been building for a while, that I need a ton of context, I know what I'm building and I clearly know the project, I don't see the value on using it. Honestly, it slows me down. I have a clear vision of what I want to build and how I want to build it. So I can go through this process of defining the what I'm building, why I'm building it, and only then the how by myself. Okay? Not a big deal. But in some projects where things are not clear for me, I'm not a specialist on that domain, or on the thing that I'm building. On certain features that are a bit more complex, I like to use it just to discover some things that I didn't thought about, some concerns, some trade-offs, some things that need clarification. So I can go through that discovery process with Spec Kit and eventually even go to the implementation and see how it feels. I might get to the end and discard everything and start over from fresh. But this process of going through these different stages with so many different opinions and research moments and predefined ways of doing it often leads to find a better solution on something that I'm not a specialist. Even then, I highly recommend you to play with it because it changes the perspective of doing vibe coding with a tool. It gives you more confidence on this type of tools, and I honestly believe that you can learn something. And if you want to learn something else about using code assistants, you want to watch this video right here, because I bet you will learn something with it.